Welcome to Buddhas in Your Landfill. This is an extended series of talks about this story of finding a Buddha in your landfill. And it's kind of an extended metaphor that uses the metaphor of the Buddha and the landfill. So what is the Buddha and what is the landfill? And why should you find one in them? And how can you find a Buddha in your landfill? And so as we go on, I hope you listen to these talks and go back from the beginning. They're not too long. And we'll be exploring this extended metaphor as we go along. Today I wanted to talk about the historical Buddha so we can get an idea of where the historical roots for the Buddha, but at the same time to realize that the Buddha is a metaphor for something within you. So let's go back to the beginning. There was a time in northern India, I think 500 years before Christ, where a prince named Siddhartha lived in a palace that was protected and filled with comfort by his father, the king. So Siddhartha would not realize the potential that a prophet said he had. When he was born, a prophet said, or a soothsayer said, he would be either a world teacher or a world king. And of course, the father wanted him to be a world king, so he protected him from anything that would trigger his other potential. So when he was in his early 30s, Buddha, or Siddhartha, decided to spontaneously take a trip into town. And since it had not been planned, the king had not had a chance to sweep all disturbing signs of life away. So the Buddha went in fresh with his charioteer, and the first thing he came upon was a sick person. And the Buddha said, "What is that?" And his valet, his charioteer said, "Master, that's sickness. We all get sick." So that perplexed the Buddha, the Siddhartha. So he went back. And the next time he went into town, he saw an old person. "What is that?" That's old age, Master. We all get old." And again, Siddhartha was perplexed, and he went back to the pleasure palace. And then finally, the town the call to leave again, and he went back into town, and he saw a dead body. "What is that?" "That is death, Master. We all die." Now this was an existential encounter Siddhartha was having with life. It is the same encounter we have when a doctor calls and says you have a lump, or the test was bad, or when someone you love dies. This is the encounter with the reality of life that our pleasure palace is designed to protect us from. So the fourth time the Siddhartha went into town, he saw a monk dressed in robes, orange robes with a bowl, a begging bowl. And he said, "What is that?" And his valet said, "Master, that is a renunciate who is trying to find the answers to the first three questions. How do we find liberation from old age, sickness, and death?" So Siddhartha knew that he was going to become a monk. So when he went back to the palace, he packed his bags and left in the night, leaving the pleasure palace, leaving the worldly life, to find the secret or the answer to the question of how do we find liberation from the suffering of old age, sickness, and death. Now this is not liberation from physical sickness, old age, and death. This is liberation from the mental suffering we have from old age, sickness, and death, which is life. Life dies. Life gets old. Life gets sick. Life dies. Everything gets old, sick, and dies. I have a betta fish in my bowl in the kitchen. It is getting old, and it's getting sick, and it will die. Whatever we have gets old, decays, gets sicknesses, decay, and dies. It leaves it. It changes or it drops off the map. So there's this fact of life is the basis for our avoidance of life. And to avoid life, we create a pleasure palace. Our whole technology, the American technology, the Western civilization, all the wonderful things of science, basically are designed to provide us a protection or a comfort zone or a comfort palace that will avoid old age, sickness, and death. So we can look at this historical journey of the Buddha as a metaphor for our own individual journeys when we realize that our pleasure palace, that all the technology and all the things we buy and all the effort and energy we spend in keeping up to the latest comfort is all in vain, that it will not give us the permanent liberation from the mental suffering that we become in our avoidance of life. So you can see the trap here. If old age, sickness, and death is the fundamental fact of life, and we avoid that, then the avoidance is the way we create the suffering we're trying to escape from. So this is the loop. This is the perfect trap. In avoiding the fundamental facts of life, we create the suffering of life, which is created by our separation from life. And so the more we try to separate ourselves from the fear of life, the more suffering we have, and the more we try to avoid it. So this keeps multiplying until we realize that something's wrong, that there is something we're missing. And at that point of realizing that what we've been doing is creating our own problems, our own suffering, at that point, we begin to look or realize that there is a Buddha in the landfill. In other words, we begin to be open to a new way of looking at life instead of the old way we've been looking at it. And this is the turning point. This is the shift that turns everything in your life around. From that shift on, the direction of your life goes in a different direction. And once you begin to taste the joy of liberation from suffering, which is thinking and avoidance, once we begin to taste the fruit of that, the energy keeps being freed from the contraction of suffering and becomes joyous and creative. And the more we taste that, the more we move into it. So it is what we're looking at here is how do we see the landfill of life that all seems to be garbage? How do we turn that into a garden where everything in it has a use, everything has a purpose, everything has possibilities, instead of being yesterday's thrown away life, you see, or garbage. So anyway, we'll continue this talk, and I hope you follow up on the earlier one, so I can just kind of like extend the pulling apart of this metaphor of finding Buddhas in your landfill. So thank you very much, and find a Buddha in your landfill. Well, I'll have to turn this off, you see.